This is a new non-caloric silicone-based kitchen lubricant my company's been working on. It creates a surface 500 times more slippery than any cooking oil.
Let her rip, Hank Pen.
Well, our sled is definitely not going to be going that fast. Welcome to Flynndogg Woodwork. Today, we're going to be making a router sled. This is a shop upgrade that I've been wanting to do for quite some time. So come along with me and see if we can build this router sled. So the first thing that I did when I decided I needed a router sled was I Googled deep, and I searched a lot of websites to try to find a router sled that would work for me. And frankly, there really isn't a whole lot of options out there, and I kept coming back to the same router sled that was made by woodpeckers. But holy cow, look at the price of this router sled. There is no way I was going to spend that kind of money for something that I'm not even sure I'm going to use all the time. So then I went down the YouTube rabbit hole, and frankly, I was a little overwhelmed as there's a million videos out there on how to build a router sled. But there was one video that I kept coming back to, and this was a video made by the YouTube channel Ideal Woodworks, and I'll leave a link in the description below so that you can go check out this video for yourself. And it's his design that I'm basing this router sled on, as I saw no other YouTube video out there that was more well thought out. So what are we going to need for this router sled? Well, let's go over to the assembly table and check out all the ingredients.
With the hotsy-totsy, the pepper sauce and
So believe it or not, there really isn't a whole lot of materials you need for this build. I've got a cheap piece of plywood that's 4x8 and 3/4 of an inch thick. I also have an aluminum angle iron that's 48 inches long. I have 2 linear rails at 1500 millimeters and 2 linear rails at 2000 millimeters. Lastly, I've got a couple pieces of scrap 2x4.
You have a 2x4? What? No, my car's all-wheel drive.
So all in, I've spent a total of about $200 in materials, which is a heck of a lot cheaper than any pre-manufactured sled. I'll leave links to those linear rails as well as that angle iron in case you want to build this sled for yourself. So you may be asking, what the heck are those linear rails? Well, let's take a closer look. So these linear rails are essentially a round substrate that allow you to attach a mounting bracket with bearings on the inside right on top of that rail. This allows these mounting brackets to slide back and forth with ease. So let's not waste any more time and start to build this sled. So one of the first things that you want to do is to spend a little extra time at the lumberyard. Make sure you get a sheet of plywood that's completely flat.
Save me a nickel, it saved me a dime. Jack's Bargain Plywood, they do it every time.
Now my sheet of plywood isn't the prettiest in the world, but she is completely flat and level. So now that we know we're building off a completely flat surface, let's take a look at the longer of the 2 linear rails. So if we look at the linear rail, you can see there's mounting holes on either side of the rail, and these are 6 inches apart and they run down the entire length of the rail. Now what I want to do is to raise that rail 1.5 inches above the plywood.
Let's get the party started.
Let's get the party started. Not the way I taught you.
Which is the exact width of a 2x4. So I could just mount a 2x4 to the edge of the plywood and then mount the rail to the 2x4. However, none of my 2x4s are completely flat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut my 2x4s into 10-inch segments. This is going to essentially eliminate any bowing or twisting in that 2x4. And frankly, these linear rails are almost as strong as I-beams, so they really don't need that much support. So I've got my stop block set to 10 inches, so I'll just run down the 2x4 and make my 10-inch segments. So now that we have our 10-inch segments cut out, let's take a look at how this is going to work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place these segments on the very edge of my plywood, and then I can place my linear rail right on top of that. So what I'm now going to do is to attach my 2x4 to the plywood, making sure that the edge of the 2x4 is right up against the edge of the plywood. And I'll do this by countersinking a couple of screw holes in each one of these 2x4s. So now that we have our segments attached to the plywood, I want to start working on our sled.
All the stores are sold out of sleds. Let's make a hillbilly sled out of a 55-gallon barrel.
And I want to do this before I actually attach the linear rails. So as you can see here, we're going to have a little bit of extra plywood on the very end. And this is what I'm going to use to make the sled. So I'm going to grab my track saw and cut off this piece. So I'll first take a couple measurements at 16 inches just so that I can line up my track saw. So since I cut that plywood down to 16 inches, I now want to take my aluminum angle iron and cut this down to 2 pieces that are 16 inches long.
You ever cut tin before?
No.
5 yards in, and your forearms will be on fire. Plus, I will buy the tin back from you that you cut for 2 cents a yard.
Now that I have my 2 pieces cut down to 16 inches long, I just want to smooth out some of those corners that have the burrs in them. So I'm just going to grab my orbital sander and sand those down. So now that we have those angle irons cut down to size and smoothed out, it's now time to talk how we're going to attach these bearings. So each one of these bearings has 4 holes that will allow us to mount it to this angle iron. And we're going to mount 2 of these bearings to each angle iron. So what I need to do is to measure out where these holes will land on the angle iron so that we can drill out some holes. Well, I'm not going to lie, that was a little bit of a tedious process, but I got it done. Let's take a look at my markings. Well, I'm not sure how well this will show up on camera, but I've got my 4 markings where I need to drill my holes. Now I'm going to drill these just a little bit oversized in case my markings aren't completely accurate. So here I am over at the drill press and I've got a temporary fence installed. I've got my crosshairs lined up with one of those holes, and I should be able to just run down the line and create at least 4 of those holes on each angle iron. Now I'm not sure this is entirely necessary, but since we're drilling through metal, I'm going to use a little bit of 3-in-1 oil just so that I can protect my bits.
Oil?
No, that's all right.
Are you sure you don't want just a dab? It's a lemon essence and it is delightful.
So I'll get started with my first 2 holes and see how well they line up with my bearings. So with a few minor adjustments, I was able to get those holes to perfectly line up with that bearing. So I'm going to continue on and drill out the rest of these holes. So now that we have the holes drilled out to mount our bearings on those angle irons, let's go back to that piece of plywood that we cut off that's 16 inches wide. So as I said before, this plywood looks pretty rough, but it is dead flat, and that's all I care about. All we need of this 16-inch strip is about a 10-inch span. So I'm going to find the nicest 10-inch span on this piece of plywood and cut it out.
Cut it out.
Now that I have my piece marked up, I'll cut out the piece that I want. So now that we have our piece of plywood cut out, I'm now going to grab a hole saw, and we're going to cut out 2 holes. We're going to cut out one in the front and one in the back. The one in the front will be for a dust collection chute, and the secondary hole will be for our router. And I'm going to use a 2-inch hole saw here, but first I need to figure out exactly where I want those holes to land. So here I'm just going to figure out the exact center of this plywood and then figure out where I want those holes to land. So now with my hole saw chucked up into my drill press, I'll now drill out my 2 holes.
It's one hole, bro.
It's one hole.
It's one hole. It's one hole.
Got 2 holes.
So now that I have my 2 holes drilled out, both for the dust collection chute as well as the router, I'm now going to take my router plate and mark out the lines where I need to drill holes so that I can mount my router to this sled. And here I'll just drill out those mounting holes. Now my router only has 2 mounting holes, so I'll do a slight chamfer on both of these holes so that those screws can sit flush. The next thing that I want to do is to attach the dust collection chute, and this is one of those adapters that has all the different sizes, so I'm just going to cut this off at the bandsaw. And here I'll just remove the bottom flute so that we're just left with this top part. And with that bottom part removed, I'll now attach my dust collection chute with some small cabinet screws. So now that we have the basic frame for this sled, it's now time to go back to our angle irons. We need to figure out how to attach these angle irons to the actual sled. So since we're using 3/4 of an inch plywood, the first thing that I want to do is to strike a line down the length of the angle iron at 3/4 of an inch. Next up, I want to mark out 4 holes on each angle iron where we can drill our holes. Now since we'll be mounting each one of these bearings on the underside of this angle iron, we want to make sure that we're not drilling holes that will interfere with these bearings. And we want to make sure that we're inside this 3/4 of an inch marking. So I'm just going to mark out 4 spots where we can drill our holes so that we can mount the sled. And now over at the drill press, I'll drill out each one of those 4 holes on both angle irons.
Today we're out finding out what type of holes people prefer. Donut holes or Hardy's new biscuit holes.
B-hole.
Yeah.
The B-hole has it over the A-hole for sure.
The A-hole seems kind of small.
It's great.
So now that we have our holes drilled out in our angle irons, let's go back to our plywood and drill out some pilot holes so that we can affix the angle irons to the plywood. So here you can see I've got my angle iron clamped directly to the plywood and everything is nice and flush. What I want to do is to drill out pilot holes at each one of these holes and then we can screw it onto the plywood. And I'm going to take this nice and slow as I want to make sure that I'm drilling these pilot holes as straight as possible. And with that angle iron still attached with the clamps, I'll now drive in some screws. Now that we have one of the angle irons attached on one side, we can repeat this process on the other. So now you can see our sled is starting to take shape. The only thing that's left to do on this piece is to add our 4 bearings. So that's what we'll do next. And I have to admit, these bearings are actually in metric. So I had to hodgepodge a bunch of screws together so that we can get these bearings mounted. So now that we have our sled essentially made, let's go back to those linear rails and play around with those for a bit. So if you remember from before, we haven't attached any of our linear rails to our workspace. What I want to do now is to attach my vertical linear rails to my horizontal rails.
How does it feel having a 3-inch vertical?
It's a 3-inch horizontal, so.
Now in my case, my vertical rails fit directly onto my bearing without having to drill any more holes. Now if yours don't fit exactly, you could drill some extra holes into the vertical rail to accommodate your size. So I'm going to attach both of my vertical rails to my horizontal bearings just so that we can see where everything lines up. So now that I have my vertical rails mounted, I now want to mount my horizontal rails. And to do this, I'm just going to take a bunch of measurements to make sure that everything's equidistant along the length of that rail. With everything lined up, I can now pre-drill and screw in that horizontal rail. So now that I have the horizontal rails installed, I now want to install that sled. So let's do that next. So I'll carefully slide on the sled so that both bearings ride on both of those rails. So the last thing that I'm going to do is to take a piece of that scrap plywood and attach it to the front of the sled and the back of the sled.
Today's quick tip is on how to use your old scrap plywood.
This will prevent the vertical linear rails from racking back and forth. And to do this, I'll simply strike a couple lines so that we can cut it down to size. So here I've cut down 2 spacers, both for the front of the sled and the back of the sled. These are the exact same width, and the only thing left to do is to mount them both to the front and the back of those linear rails. And to do this, I'm simply going to run a couple of cabinet screws into each rail. And we'll do the same thing on the far side. However, this side didn't have the holes for those cabinet screws, so I had to drill those out. Well, that wraps up today's router sled build. I'm really pleased with the result, and this thing glides easily left and right and up and down so you can get your router wherever you want it. So I'm one step closer to finishing off that slab desk for my wife. I really hope you enjoyed today's build, and if you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and leave a comment. It really does help out this small woodworking channel. Until next time, take care as always.